Okay, we're going to go on ahead and get started. I do have a few housekeeping items to take care of before we dive into today's event. First and foremost, happy Friday, everybody. I hope you're doing wonderful. Next, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors. They make ESPN possible and they make this event possible as well. And to that, I'd like to thank our event sponsors for making the event possible. We do have some great upcoming events, and if you would like to join us on October 8th at 11 a.m. Eastern, we are going to be doing the secret sauce to fixing healthcare. It will be a live interactive program. If you would like to attend, simply send me a message in the chat and I will go on ahead and get you taken care of today. So just go on ahead and ping me in the chat box if you would like to attend that event and I will get you taken care of. And with that, I am excited and honored to introduce Dr. Vogenberg. Dr. Vogenberg is the principal for the Institute for Integrated Healthcare in Greenville, South Carolina, formerly in Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston, Massachusetts. At his firm, he and his associates from the business clinical scientific communities focus on commercial employee benefits, care delivery, and outcome research, education, strategic benefits consulting on medical, legal, clinical, or economic issues in commercial healthcare. He's extremely knowledgeable in this, and he will truly help you understand how to make the value-based decisions that will impact your medical and pharmacy programs. And with that, it is my distinct honor to turn this program over to Randy. Randy, the show is yours.
Thank you, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to be talking about how you can start working towards creating a positive impact on medical and pharmacy programs through value-based decisions. It's an area that I've been involved with for a long time now. And there's lots of opportunities today, and that's part of what I'll be talking about. The other organization that I work with is the Employer Provider Interface Council, which is a sister organization of the Hospital Quality Foundation. And that's comprised of healthcare professionals that are dedicated to transforming employer and provider healthcare collaboration. EPIC, as it's known, is the only national group that is a collaborative and integrated group of employers and providers who work with all related organizations in all the geographic areas of the United States. It's the mission of EPIC to provide insight, information, and guidance to employer and provider decision makers by providing an environment that allows these stakeholders to focus thought, develop key metrics, and design care management strategies that affect change within populations of patients. You can go to the next slide. So we have some periodic meetings when we were able to meet, and this is kind of a representative snapshot of people that get together that really represent all the different key stakeholders in healthcare. At that time, having a conference in New Jersey last year, which was hosted by Rutgers University and their Health Outcomes Policy and Economics Center. What I'm going to be talking about today are what are some of the trends in brief, what are some of the considerations that employers should be thinking about, more strategy rather than tactical, what are some of the opportunities that are out there, and then how do you begin to start rethinking and assessing value in real world, and give you kind of a case example of how you work through that. And then wrapping up with what's the future going to look like, kind of a crystal ball discussion of sorts. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A or other topics you may want to try and talk about. So next slide. So starting with trends, one of the big trends that affects everybody is that Americans today are continuing to avoid seeking care, about 40% on a national basis. And there's concern among many employers that I've talked with and at other employer meetings around the country, what are some of the long-term implications of this, particularly when you think about chronic conditions. So as we move away from just our 100% focus around COVID, we do have to think about what do these behaviors begin to put into play and how will affect our workforce as we go forward. Next slide. So there was a survey that was conducted and released in August of this year where they asked questions of what were the patient concerns and how employees were utilizing care. And the important takeaway is that, as I mentioned, there's 40% around the country, but benefit designs did not change. Benefit coverage did not change. So this was clearly driven by employees or their family members as patients who were deciding not to seek care. So as I circled here in red in South Carolina, where I live right now, it's almost 42% of patients surveyed said that they weren't going to access care. And if we look across the South, the numbers ranged anywhere from around 42 down to maybe 40% even. And that was kind of similar. So the range was fairly tight around the country from 30 to 50%. So consistently, this is a problem that has gone from bad to worse when we think about employer benefit planning going into the new calendar year. Next slide. So some of the other considerations that kind of feed off of that change in accessing care is that we've had underspending of the 2020 health benefits budget. In a way, that's kind of good. You might get some money back. You may have saved some money. But as cost trends continue to rise, we're going to have to start thinking differently about what our plans going to look like in 21 and 2022 as an example. So while it's kind of short-term good news of sorts from a financial perspective, that means there's a lot of underlying disease that's either not being detected, there's no screening going on, or in many cases, they're not seeking active treatment. A good example is in talking with some of my colleagues in oncology, they had as much as an 80–85% drop off in patients seeking cancer care. So these were already diagnosed patients, patients that were already in the system, so to speak. And basically there was no screening going on. So there's a lot of catch up that needs to happen just looking at cancer care. There's similar concerns when we look at cardiovascular conditions as well as respiratory conditions. So there is no best framework that we have in the market today to assess and manage for value. There are lots of tools out there. There's a lot of research that goes on in this area. They all have some strengths and limitations. And basically what it comes down to is you really have to use multiple frameworks and tools to adequately assess value. So there's no silver or great bullet that we can shoot to solve this problem. There isn't a single program or a single solution, let alone an integrated solution that really has been working well. Vendor collaboration and data integration as a result has become even more essential. And we've learned these lessons the hard way in terms of what's happened with our pandemic response and how COVID-19 has been treated. It kind of showed the bad underbelly of our healthcare system, where we still have not integrated data. There's not good communication across different stakeholders. And if you yourself has been a patient or you've been using the healthcare system, you know yourself that it can be very frustrating as a result when for the umpteenth time, a clinician or a nurse at intake is asking the same questions that you've answered 100 times. So the same issue is out there in terms of how do we start thinking about value when we look at our benefit design, particularly from a strategy perspective. The next slide. So with those considerations, we have to think about, well, what other considerations are out there that we need to start thinking about? So what kinds of information is available? We have a problem with transparency many times with data. We hear a lot about what's going on, but we may not actually have the actual data. We're also sometimes concerned from an employer perspective about the reliability of that data. And in many times, the kinds of information that we're given is not really that useful. So how meaningful are the measures and the different pieces of data that you may be getting as an employer? And does it really help you in making good benefit design decisions as you're moving forward? So both the medical and the pharmacy benefit are what we're really talking about here in particular. And that covers a lot when we start thinking about it. And we need to start looking at it probably more from the member's perspective or the patient perspective, which we call patient-centered care as an example. We need to think about patient-centered benefit design as well. We need to be fully aligned as the plan sponsor with the members of the plan that we're trying to take care of with these healthcare benefits. So we need to be thinking like them. What are they likely to do? How are we affecting their behaviors and so forth? We also need to think about a more system-wide perspective and a holistic view of how care happens, what's going on in the clinical care, the different sites of care that are out there, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, as well as the economics that are associated with where your members are getting their care. And this is something we've learned as well from the pandemic experience, that we have to look much broadly. The effects of one domino falling really knocks a lot of dominoes down. And so we have to be thinking that same way when we look at any kind of traditional medical and pharmacy benefits. We also have to be sure that the way in which we're going about doing it and the assessment that we're taking, that method has been validated, or the multiple methods that you may be using are validated, so that they're providing you with sound advice and that the impact on members is understood. And I can't tell you the number of times over the last 20 or so years and working with employers of all different sizes and types of industry, that many times you get called in to help solve a problem that was really created by something that could have been avoided in thinking about it on the front end when they were developing their benefit design. One of the other things you want to consider is that whatever you're putting out there, whether it's information or the benefit design, how you're lining up your network, is not confusing. Confusing to not only your member, but also to the providers of care, whether it's on the medical side with physicians and nursing and other support services that happen under the medical benefit, as well as under the pharmacy benefit, because those are the people that many times the member of the plan as the patient is asking questions. What is covered in my benefit design? What can I do? What I cannot do? And in the absence of some clear understanding and direction, it could end up being much more costly, and you're not getting the outcomes that you're looking for. So you want to make sure that the impacts of your benefit design are clear and actionable, not only by your member, but also by those that are providing care. Next slide. So there's some key opportunities. You don't have to rework everything in your benefit, but you do need to be thinking about it, as I mentioned, in that kind of broad scale. So the first thing is, from a management perspective, when you start looking at your benefit design, while you may look at what's 100% of my population look like, what are my top 10 diseases, what are my top 10 drugs, et cetera, what's probably more impactful is to look at the smaller percent of your population that's really driving more of your cost. So that ends up being somewhere between maybe 2 to 20% of your population is really where you need to focus more of your time and attention. 10 to as much as 40% of your savings can depend on having that kind of knowledge about your experience in your covered population. And that also comes out very clearly when we look at sites of care differentials. So we talk about what's happening at a hospital, what's happening at an outpatient clinic or a freestanding independent center, or what services are being delivered in the home. The difference in cost is dramatic. And again, you're talking about a much smaller percentage of the population. On the pharmacy benefit side, same principles generally apply. Most everybody today is covering generics over brand products. We've pretty much maxed that out. All the new products that are coming out of the FDA are generally going to be in the more biotech space as well as gene therapy space. So you have to start thinking very differently. So this 2 to 20% rule becomes very important because that's where your costs are going to continue to escalate rapidly as we go into 21 and 22 as an example. So we have to be thinking about not just drugs, but we have to also be thinking about how are they determining which drug is going to be used. So diagnostics becomes important, and that's paid under the medical benefit. The other thing today, drugs are getting much more specific in their use, not only as a drug, but also in the delivery of the drug product itself. So there are many times devices that are either built into the drug delivery, like with the respiratory product, or increasingly now we're beginning to see that with some of the other products that may come out as a patch, or the way in which the drug is made, where there may be these miniature devices that are incorporated with these products. So the costs are going to continue to go up for a variety of reasons, but the specificity and the outcomes are going to be significantly more improved, fewer side effects, and overall lower costs. So when we think about value and we're trying to assess value, we're going to have to start looking at what we're doing in our benefits in a much more holistic fashion. We have to be thinking about not only the drug benefit, for example, but also what's going on in the medical benefit, what's being paid for the use of that drug under the medical benefit side. More specifically, there's some opportunities when we look at biosimilars. Biosimilars are what we tend to talk about as the new generic drugs. They're not an exact copy like we have with the non-biologic products, but they're similar enough, and that's why they're called biosimilars. And these have been available in Europe and in other countries for many years already. They're beginning to be available in the US, mainly because of patent expirations or patent deals that have been made that are allowing biosimilars to come on the market now. It's taken 10 years to get us to this point. So there are some savings opportunities, but more importantly, we're not sacrificing any safety or efficacy associated with these products and treating these conditions. So we can look at biosimilars as an area of opportunity. The other area of opportunity is, well, what are we doing in chronic conditions? So these are long-term, long-lasting. They tend to be progressive diseases that get worse over time. So we can think about cardiology, respiratory diseases as an example. But increasingly, oncology is also a chronic condition today. And in some cases, immunologic conditions, such as arthritis, are a chronic condition that are being treated with some of these biologic products in place of the non-biologic products. We're seeing the same thing begin to happen with migraine. And in a workforce that's becoming dominated by women, migraines are much more common in women. So this is becoming a real value area for women to better manage their migraine, as an example, and to make them more productive and able to work. And that's been a real game changer in the marketplace. We're also seeing in the area of allergy and sinusitis, some different products coming on the market that are a combination of device with a drug, which improves the efficacy of the products. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. And that helps us eliminate waste at the same time. So again, having a little bit more of a holistic view becomes very beneficial. In a similar way, when we look at surgical procedures and how we manage post-operative pain, that is one of the major pain points, no pun intended, when we look at the opioid crisis. Many of the problems that we're seeing with employees who get addicted to opioids, it started with some post-operative pain management. And today there are a variety of different products that be used around the time of the procedure or actually during the procedure that provide that immediate relief of pain and allows you to use the OTC products that are not addictive and avoid using opioids altogether. So we have to rethink some of our benefit strategies to allow these types of different strategies and innovations and how we manage chronic conditions to happen. It's not unusual in reviewing problem cases that I get from brokers, consultants, and employers directly, that they just haven't kept up with what are the current ways in which you manage chronic conditions. And that's a big opportunity for employers to help their plan members and workers be taken care of more appropriately. And in most cases, you can end up actually saving money. The other area is prevention. And we're hearing a lot more because of the pandemic around vaccinations. And we're waiting for a vaccine to complete clinical trials and be approved by FDA for COVID-19. But there are many other conditions where there's a vaccination out there, whether we're talking about teenagers with HPV vaccine, the flu vaccine, and many others. And the vaccination rates had gone down. People were not seeing their primary care provider. And in the pharmacies, that volume was down too, other than refilling prescriptions. Interestingly, most of the pharmacy business really wasn't that badly affected compared with visits to the physician offices. So it's kind of interesting. So we've had this disproportionate impact on vaccinations going down, which is not a good thing as we look forward. That's going to be a potential area of concern for employers, where people may end up with some avoidable diseases that are going to have to be treated. And they're going to be treated usually with more expensive drugs. And so this area of prevention is something we cannot forget about. It's an important area for everybody. One other area I promised to mention as we think about where we can assess value, there was a series of studies over the last several years done by RAND with employers in the commercial insurance space. There was the original RAND, which was 1.0. RAND 2.0 looked at data coming out of 2017. And RAND 3.0, which was just released, was looking at data coming out of 2018. And the bottom line and the headline of the results, which just was released this morning, as a matter of fact, so it's hot off the presses, employers and private insurance companies have paid hospitals 240% of what Medicare would have. And that's RAND 3.0. RAND 2.0 showed that it was 241%. So this site of care is really something that's important to look at, and you'll miss it unless you're looking at your benefit strategy more holistically. So let's talk about an example of how you can start looking at value more holistically in your benefit design. And this comes from a tool, if you look at the next slide, that we were involved in developing to help employers better align their strategy and what their tactical benefit planning would look like, and being able to kind of model out what are some of the important issues to be looking at, and what would be the results that would come out of making different decisions around your benefit. And this came about after a couple of years worth of research working with employers on developing this, testing it with employers, and actually having it out in the field with employers in 2019. Next slide. So this purchaser analysis tool, we start with very basic input. We do it by condition. We do all the heavy lifting in the background, the setup, what's going to be key inputs and information that you need. What are the characteristics of your population that are important relative to this condition? And what we're really grabbing here is what are the number of covered employees by key age groups. And that's typically what becomes important is, so how young or how old is your working population, and what does the percentage look like? So we have sliding bars that we use just to make it easier to play around with what this looks like. And that's why it was very popular with the employers that we worked with, because they were looking for flexibility when they were in the early stages of designing their benefit strategy. This has become more important because of the pandemic. The impact of furloughs and layoffs is also changing what your population characteristics typically look like, but the condition has stayed the same. The medical diagnosis doesn't change. So there's even more value today than there was when we were first doing this. We look at employees on the left side there in the blue color, and members on the right, so you can kind of track are the differences in terms of what happens with employees versus members when we get to the next couple of slides showing some of the outputs. So the next slide shows you the first output. To give you an example of, again, this specific condition with the population that you've identified. Well, so what does the annual care cost look like? And what does it look like for both of your employees as well as for all insured? So we kind of track that. And for this example condition, there's 4 treatment options. You may have elected to not cover a particular treatment, which we're calling treatment number 3. But it tells you where you're spending your money under treatment 1 and 2 and 4. And you can see 4 on the right is the one that's the most expensive, which in this particular condition would relate typically to surgeries, which is the most expensive thing that you could do. So we're not doing a lot of the less expensive things. And treatment 3 is another example of a product that could be used, or device that could minimize the need for some of these surgeries. And so we have a slider bar on the left where we can say, let's look at treatment 3 and see what the impact is. And so we can say we may have a 10% uptake or 100% uptake. What's the economics of that as an example? Next slide. What's also important is not only does the condition not change, even though your population might, is what are the comorbidities? What are the other issues that are typically happening in your patient population that you're covering, whether they're an employee or a family member? And usually there's a triad of conditions. So we may be studying one condition, but there are 2 other comorbidities. And that's what this shows here. Where you do have 2 other comorbidities, one is not as prevalent as the other. So it helps you in thinking about, in your benefit design, what you need to be thinking about in other conditions, not just the one that we're particularly talking about here. And the same kind of played out under the members. You see it's almost a 3-to-1 impact of comorbidity 2 that we want to be paying attention to, because we may be doing a good job on the particular condition of interest that we're looking at, but if we don't also address this comorbidity 2, everything that we're doing for the original condition may be for naught, because that comorbidity will overpower what we're trying to accomplish in our benefit design. So this is a way to kind of simply get a sense of what are we dealing with and what do we need to be thinking about for both our employees as well as for the members in the plan overall. And the next slide shows you what we call the indirect costs. And what we typically do, because there's a lot of soft numbers that get thrown around when we think about indirects, is we look at what are the harder numbers that really relate to more employers. And this is where we work closely with a lot of the employers. And all along the way, by the way, we have everything referenced. Where's all this information coming from? What are the sourcing and so forth? So we look at things in absence like sickness and disability or other paid time off, where there are metrics that you're already tracking, and these are numbers that are actually meaningful to you, as I mentioned earlier. And as you could see, there's a fairly large numbers. And thinking back to the treatment cost of the condition, these numbers are actually higher than the treatment cost for the condition. Work restrictions is the other area where we look at, does the employee have an ability to return to work at 100%? Most cases, they're coming back and they're maybe 25 or 50%. So there's some kind of work restriction. They're not at 100%. And so there's a dollar value that the Department of Labor associates with that. And all this data comes from employers. This is all reportable data under workers' comp and disability as an example. So again, these numbers are large numbers in terms of the impact on your enterprise. And since health benefits affects your bottom line, this is part of what's affecting your bottom line, but we don't typically see that because we're so focused on that first slide I showed you from this model, which just looks at the direct costs that we're paying on claims under the healthcare benefit. So this gives you a much broader view of what's happening and where there could be opportunities to save money in multiple places in terms of when you're really developing that benefit design. So let's go on to the next slide. So as we try and think, where are we headed? Where are we going? There's a lot of confusion right now. There's a lot of people saying we're in transition right now. We're coming out of COVID, we're coming back into whatever our new normal is. But we also know, if you go to the next slide, that that crystal ball is pretty cloudy. And there's a lot of different viewpoints that still are out there in the market. So on the left side, you see where we were in the pandemic going through the summer. So we kind of knew what was happening in terms of the positive COVID-19 tests and that daily count that we heard all the time that seemed to make no sense some days and made perfect sense on other days. That's what the trend kind of looked like when that March through early August. But as we're thinking not only through the end of this year in 2020, but what 2021 might look like, because we've either already developed our benefit plan or we're just finalizing it now. You're either going to have a pessimistic view or you're going to have an optimistic view. And that's not only of the pandemic, but also of what are you going to be doing in your coverage design as we start going forward. So it's uniquely challenging for all of us that are involved with healthcare benefits these days, as we think about not only the rest of 2020, but also 21 and 22. So the next slide kind of talks about, well, what are some of these transition issues that we're kind of focused around right now, and where we're going to be heading coming out of this into 2021. So right now, the primary HR benefit focus for sure is the Back to Work plan and implementation, and that's kind of operating on a continuous cycle of review and implementation. We're constantly reviewing that plan and implementing changes as we go along. As we're learning, or as we have a positive case reported in our business. In 2021, as I mentioned, as we've either already finalized or getting ready to roll it out, or whatever the case may be for your organization, for the most part, what we're expecting to see is everybody's going to make sure that telemedicine is covered, that telehealth is covered in some way, shape, or form. But experts are telling us, even though there was a huge shift to using the telemedicine platforms, that the expectation is only about 20% of visits in 21 will really be through this telehealth methodology. And that there is a lot of value still in having that ability to touch the patient, to understand what's really happening with that patient face to face. So there's still limitations with what we can do with telehealth, and that includes telepharmacy, which is something that also was ramped up during this pandemic, and pharmacy-related counseling, which again, for the most part, was focused around that 2 to 20% that I was telling you about earlier. So again, this is not going to be for everybody. So when we think about structural changes in the marketplace, while the employers that I talk to are saying, well, we're expecting that to happen, the market's going to do it, the market's really looking to the employers to say, well, what do you want? What do you want to do? What do you think is going to be most beneficial to you? So employers have to be engaged in looking at these structural changes, just not expecting that it's going to happen in the marketplace. So we have to look at all the benefit topics that are covered under the HR benefits, and particularly those are the most relevant post-COVID, looking at chronic conditions. We need to also look at how we're interacting with our vendor partners, how we're collaborating with them, what kinds of information are we sharing, how inclusive are we being in our discussions around these different benefit topics, and are we also looking at different ways that we could be working together financially, either in a shared or alternative risk arrangement scenario, for example, in addition to a focus around outcomes that are meaningful to you as a benefit plan sponsor in particular. And this has taken on a lot more interest. We saw that in 2020 already, but it's still there for 21 and 22. And the thinking is that we're going to see a lot more. There's more interest by manufacturers of healthcare products and services to look at these shared risk arrangements. They kind of like that. It also can help us potentially simplify the number of third-party players that we have to deal with. And there could be more direct arrangements through facilitative organizations that streamline your efforts and help you be more effective in your benefit design. So there's a real opportunity here, not only for employer leadership on these issues, but also for provider leadership. And particularly as we go into 2020 into 21, making our employees and plan members feel safe, not only in the workplace, but also in the healthcare delivery system, that it's okay to go back and receive your primary care, get your screening done, make sure that the care that's being delivered is effective. And all this has to happen as a collaboration between that employer and that provider. They have to be on the same page. The benefit design needs to encourage that kind of cooperation and collaboration and not create barriers that we see is really not being effective post-pandemic. So we have to really rethink what are we doing and what's the value in a lot of ways we design strategies today that probably aren't going to make sense coming out of this pandemic. And particularly from an economic perspective, for that 2 to 20% of the population, how you design your benefits needs to be done differently than how we've done it in the past. It's something that's been talked about for a long time, but now is the time to take action as everything's being put on a reset button right now. So it's a perfect time to start making some of these changes that make more sense all the way around. So next slide, please. So to kind of summarize what we've talked about here this morning, when we look at all the trends, not just the ones I talked about, but many others that are out there and experts are putting out there with their clients or in publications, it's clear now that it's a time to take action and that more strategic planning in particular needs to happen among the HR benefit personnel in any company. We tended to be more focused on implementation and tactical planning just for a single year. The COVID crisis kind of illustrated that we need to be thinking a little bit more broadly. So even smaller companies that tended to be much more tactical need to have some strategic component to their thought process. The considerations in the marketplace around healthcare, both under medical and pharmacy benefits, are very well established. There's a lot of case studies out there that demonstrate the value of new strategies, the value of looking at assessing your plans, both from a design and implementation perspective in a different light, and then how you access your data, what is meaningful data to look at, and how you can be more informed as a decision maker around this integration for your medical and pharmacy benefits. It could be a virtual integration or it could be a complete integration. There's a variety of ways that can be done. There really aren't the barriers out there that there used to be. So it's a real opportunity for the HR benefit professionals and their consultants and brokers to start driving these kinds of changes. The opportunities abound now. We've learned so much from COVID about what we really shouldn't be doing. So we really need to be thinking strategically and holistically around what we should be doing. And that's how we're going to extract planned value. So that assessment and achieving value now is more close in hand than it's ever been as long as I've been doing healthcare benefits. So this is a great time to get engaged and start looking at what we're doing in our plans. You can assess value in the real world in a variety of ways. I showed you one case example using a modeling tool. There are lots of other tools out there from a whole variety of vendors. The important thing is to have clarity and transparency in what they're showing you around the process and the methodology to make sure that it's clear and actionable, well documented, and that it's something that you can follow up with. There's the low-hanging fruit for sure, but there's many other opportunities out there, not only to look at economic savings, but also for the same amount of money that you're spending today to get much better outcomes that are longer lasting outcomes that over time actually reduce your cost of care. And that was a concept that was actually conceived and implemented back in the 90s and done by Pitney Bowes, who had published numerous articles and data from their plan experience, which continues to this day. Yet most employers really haven't jumped on board. Now is the time to start doing that. So I've covered a lot of material, some of it very thinly, some a little bit more deeply, but I want to give you some time to ask some questions, and I can also provide some additional information on some of these elements if you don't have a lot of questions. So let's go to the Q&A, or you can contact me afterwards as well. So next slide.
So we do have a couple of questions that have come in.
Okay, good.
The first one is, where are employers to get more information about biosimilars? How much can we save on the medical or pharmacy benefit through the use of biosimilars?
Okay, that's a good question. So there's a lot more out there. It's been probably the last year, all of a sudden, we've had a deluge of information around biosimilars. I hate to say it, but the fastest, easiest way is you can Google it. There are some sites that are focused around biosimilars that you can find on LinkedIn as well. There's blogs on it. And the savings, it all depends on your population and the characteristics of your population. So similar to, I use the example of hemophilia all the time. Most employers are aware of hemophilia. They know it's a very expensive condition to manage. But most employers don't have a patient with hemophilia. So similarly, you may have an opportunity to use biologics in your population, although that's decreasing in likelihood. But biosimilars are also right now limited to just a handful of conditions. The savings that we've seen there have been anywhere from about 5 to 15% on a stable basis. Sometimes it's as much as 20%. And that's kind of based off of what you may be paying for the branded biologic product. So there's a nice opportunity similar to what we had seen with generics back in the 80s and 90s when they first came out, that you can get a nice savings there. But you still have to make sure that the condition is being properly managed, they're following the care protocols and so forth. That would include that particular biologic drug that would be available as a biosimilar. And I have other sources. If you contact me, I can certainly get you that information around biosimilars.
We have another question around biosimilars, somewhat similar to the question you just answered, so it might be a slight repeat. The talk of biosimilars is ramping up. What is the best way to prepare or understand the possibility of the impact, which you kind of did just cover, but is there anything else you would like to add?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think as part of your benefit planning, you look at the complete list of biologic products, which typically would be considered under your specialty drugs, and what does your utilization look like? As I mentioned, there's only a handful of conditions right now where there are biosimilars available, but that number is increasing rapidly as FDA catches up on approving biosimilars, and these patents continue to expire over the next several years. So it's something that you want to make sure you're not being excluded from the ability to use biosimilars in terms of coverage in your plan. But the immediate opportunity may be a little more limited for you, so that assessing your population, what does your claims experience look like, what's your age demographics look like, are different keys to trying to understand where there may be opportunities for you and your plan with biosimilars. Hopefully that helps. And again, feel free to email me, and I can follow up with you in more detail if you need it. And my email is randy@iih-online.com.
Okay, we have another question. Some brokers are advocating for groups to enter into direct contracts with providers. Do you see this as a necessary, beneficial strategy?
Yeah. Direct contracts, I think, are going to continue to increase. Similar to what we saw with on-site clinics. We moved from the old Occ Health to having on-site clinics. They ramped up a little bit. They've kind of been static growth over the last couple of years because it doesn't really fit all employers. But some of these new direct contracts with primary care physicians and physician groups are very similar to the near-site clinic kind of concept. So for smaller employers now, there's a real opportunity for the primary care to take advantage of some of this direct contracting. And they're much more efficient in what they do with their decision-making. It's all evidence-based. They're typically located in your community. They have a lot of capabilities. So I see that growing over time as an option. And I think part of the reason why I believe that is we're seeing hospitals now getting more engaged in doing the same thing. they're standing up some of these similar kinds of organizations and trying to do direct contracting with employers in these local communities. So you're probably in some areas of the country being inundated with that. In other parts of the country, you may not seen that much as yet, but it's coming. So it could be a very cost-efficient strategy, and also streamlining some of your benefit design. It kind of simplifies it in some ways around the primary care. So that's good for the 80% of your client base, as an example. If you're a consultant or a broker, as an employer, that 80-20 rule also applies to you, because that 80% of your population, you want to keep them healthy. That's the most cost-effective thing you can do. That's why vaccines are so important, as an example. But you still have to be aware of that 20%. So you really have what I see evolving as two different strategies. One for that 80% of your population that you're employing primarily. And then the second strategy, where you're looking at that 2 to 20%, where you're going to have to be much more engaged and have more tactical options that are going to be different than what you're doing with the other 80%. You can't have one size fits all. It's just the nature of where we're headed with the solutions that are coming out into the marketplace. So we have to kind of keep our head on a swivel a little bit here, going from this prevention of the 80% of our population to also dealing with the high cost that we're seeing in the 20% of our population.
We have another question here on telehealth. Mm-hmm. After COVID-19, is there an expectation that telehealth will continue to grow, drop off, or remain about the same?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question, because most people saw triple-digit growth in their utilization of telehealth, as an example. Under the executive order, it basically allowed telehealth to happen, and it was done at parity, which means that the claim that a provider submitted for a telehealth visit was paid at the same rate as a physical visit. That's unlikely to continue as of January 1, and there will be a differential in most plans. So that means the telehealth reimbursement will probably go back to closer to where it was. It's probably going to be a little bit more than it was before, but that will cause a drop off. And so there's still going to be a value to having those in-person visits, face-to-face visits that are live. So telehealth, as I kind of alluded to earlier, it will drop down in numbers that we've seen to date as we hit January 2021. Where it will settle in, it'll probably, my guess is somewhere between 20 to 30% of visits will probably end up being in that telehealth area. And that, again, includes not just the medical telemedicine, but also pharmacy, telepharmacy. And that's probably an underused service, to be honest, because so many of these chronic conditions are generally related to a medication problem, that it can be more cost efficient to deal with it as a telepharmacy versus a telemedical visit. So we have a lot going on. It's going to continue to evolve, but that's kind of the general gist of where we see that fitting in.
Those are actually, I'm not going to lie, the 20 to 30% was a bit, I shouldn't have been shocked by it, but I was a bit shocked by that. So I want to remind everybody, if you do have any questions, please feel free. There's a couple of ways you can raise your hand. You can use the chat feature, or you can use the Q&A feature. We do have one more. Vaccines are very much in the news, creating some anxieties. Any thoughts on how this might impact plans or with plan strategies moving forward?
I assume, is this related to the COVID virus vaccine, I assume?
Well, I think, and I believe it is, but I would add to this though, I know personally I have seen, I do believe the question is in COVID-19, but it was not specified. I know there's also the anti-vaxxer situations that are
Right.
also now coming more and more to the forefront with the complication of COVID-19 added to it.
Sure. Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, vaccines are a very important pillar of a preventive strategy. And there has been a lot of, and the anti-vaxxer movement had been very active in 2019 and earlier in 2020. It probably will continue through the rest of this year, even with the COVID vaccine. There's some people that I've talked to that said they're not going to take the COVID vaccine either. So there's some people you're just not going to be able to change their minds. The vaccines are safe. Long-term studies have been done on all these vaccines. They're not causing disease. There's always the chance that 1 in a million are going to have some kind of reaction, or 1 in 500,000 might have a different kind of reaction. But for the most part, they're very well characterized, and we know what to expect, which really is not much. You might have a little injection site pain like you would with any injection. But other than that, the ones that have been on the market are safe and they're generally effective. The caveat, and we're learning that with COVID as an example, is that when we get into the viruses, and we see this with the flu vaccine that we have, we're going to have it with the COVID vaccine, is the viruses can mutate. And it's that mutation that causes problems with vaccinations, because there's such a long manufacturing cycle that when they prepare the vaccines, say for the annual flu season, which we're in right now, that decision was made last fall. And it's made internationally, actually. There's an international consortium that deals with this. And so they try and come up with what's the best mix in the product that will give you the most protection against the known flu viruses. But because these viruses can mutate, it's never going to be 100%. And we're going to have the same thing most likely with the COVID-19. You're going to have some great results potentially, but you may have some differing results in different parts of the country, all depending on what happens with these mutations, which are based on individuals and how active the virus is in different parts of the country. But that has nothing to do with the safety of the vaccine itself. It's highly unlikely that there's going to be any safety issues with these COVID vaccines. The issue is really going to be more about what percent effectiveness are they going to end up being. And that's what you're kind of hearing in the Washington debate these days, of how soon will they have it and how effective will it be. And it all relates to this virus mutation problem that we know it's existed forever with viruses. So I hope that covers all those aspects of vaccines.
Randy, I would like to thank you very much for your time today. And at this point, I would like to give everybody the opportunity to take a quick break. We don't have any more questions in the queue. We do have Randy's information, and this will be available online. So if you are a member of ESPN, you will have access to this information. And should anybody need his contact information, if they're not able to catch it here, just email events@espn.org, and I will get that information over to you right away. With that, Randy, I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday. Please feel free to join in for the next session that we have. And we will be starting that session here shortly.